sleeps.
Welcome, my fellow fear enthusiasts. The doctor is in. And tonight I have another terrifying tale for you. The clipboard felt like a lead weight in my hand, its sterile white surface a mocking contrast to the gloom of the corridor. I adjusted my spectacles, the bridge of my nose slick with a sudden localized perspiration. Elias, I chided myself. You are a man of science. You are here to map the architecture of the fractured mind, not to succumb to the parlor tricks of an antiquated building. I pushed open the door to room 9. The hinges groaned, a dry, rusted sound that seemed to linger in the air long after the door had settled against the wall. The room was standard issue, a single cot, a bolted-down nightstand, and a window reinforced with heavy-gauge mesh that filtered the weak gray daylight into geometric bars across the floor. The patient was sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to me. His shoulders were hunched, a skeletal curve beneath a hospital gown that hung like a shroud. He didn't turn. He didn't even acknowledge the intrusion. I stepped forward, my polished Oxfords clicking sharply on the linoleum. "Mr. Holloway, I'm Dr. Vance. I'd like to begin our initial intake session." Silence. The air in the room felt heavy, pressurized, like the moments before a thunderstorm. I checked my watch. The second hand ticked with a sluggish, rhythmic pulse that made my stomach turn. I stepped closer, intending to place a hand on his shoulder, when my foot slipped. I stumbled, catching myself on the bed frame. I looked down, and the breath hitched in my throat. Beneath the bed, right in the center of the pristine floor-waxed expanse, was a thick, irregular smear of dark, wet earth. It wasn't just dust or debris. It was heavy, black loam, the kind found in deep, damp woodland, clotted with decaying leaves and something that looked disturbingly like rotted root fibers. I knelt, my medical detachment warring with a visceral, rising nausea. The mud was fresh. It was glistening. It radiated a cold that seeped through my trousers and into my skin. "Mr. Holloway," I said, my voice sounding thin and alien in the small room. "How did this get here?" The patient let out a low, rattling wheeze. It wasn't a laugh, and it wasn't a sob. It was the sound of air passing through a collapsed lung. "It's not for you to see, doctor," he whispered. His voice was raspy, dry as parchment. "The ground has to go somewhere. The floor. It gets tired of being the floor." I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched the edge of the mud. It was ice cold, yet it felt soft, almost inviting, like wet velvet. I stood up quickly, wiping my hand on my lab coat, a smear of dark filth staining the white fabric. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird-like rhythm. "Rationalize," the voice in my head commanded. "A leak in the ceiling? No. That would be water, not potting soil. An orderly playing a prank? The staff here are jaded, sure, but they are terrified of the hierarchy. Thorn would have their heads. A hallucination?" I looked at the clipboard. The ink on my intake form was already beginning to blur, the letters twisting into shapes that no longer looked like English. "I am going to call for an attendant," I said, backing toward the door. "Don't," the patient said, finally turning his head. I stopped. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown out until his irises were nothing more than slivers of pale gray. He looked past me, into the empty air, with a terrifying blank intensity. "If you move, the walls will know you're watching," he said, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "The house is hungry for a new set of eyes, doctor. You have such observant ones." I didn't answer. I turned and walked out, closing the door behind me with a decisive thud. I stood in the hallway, pressing my back against the wall, trying to regulate my breathing. The corridor looked different, or perhaps it was just the way the flickering fluorescent light was casting shadows that seemed to stretch and pull, reaching for my heels. The antiseptic smell, bleach and stale linens, seemed to have soured, replaced by the damp metallic scent of the earth in room 9. I shook my head, fighting the dizziness. Blackwood is old. It has pipes. It has history. And history is just dust. I started walking, aiming for the nurse's station, but as I turned the corner, I stopped dead. The hallway didn't end at the stairwell. It stretched out, a long converging line of identical doors, extending far further than the physical footprint of the building should have allowed. I looked back. The door to room 9 was gone. In its place was a blank, windowless wall, the paint peeling in long, blistered strips that looked remarkably like dead skin. My hands flew to my face, my pulse roaring in my ears. I reached into my pocket for my pen, for my keys, for anything solid, anything that tethered me to the world outside these walls. My fingers brushed against something hard, cold and metallic. I pulled it out. It was a key, heavy and rusted, with a bow shaped like a weeping eye. I hadn't had this key when I walked in. I hadn't had it when I left the car. I stared at the key, then at the impossible, stretching hallway, and for the first time since I'd arrived at Blackwood, the intellectual arrogance that had been my armor didn't just crack, it shattered. I wasn't an observer anymore. I was a component, and the building had finally started to pay attention to me. The heavy iron key felt like a branding iron against my thigh, burning through the fabric of my trousers. I stared at the blank, featureless wall, where the door to room 9 had been only seconds ago. My breath came in ragged, shallow hitches, fogging the cold air that seemed to have bled out of the room with me. Geometry. It's a trick of light, or perhaps a structural failure in these old foundations. I gripped the bridge of my nose, pinching the skin until it bruised. Schizophrenic environments? No. Auditory visual hallucinations triggered by the stress of arrival? Possible. Likely. My training demanded a diagnosis, a label I could affix to the moment to strip it of its power. If I could name the delusion, I could treat it. But the persistent, damp smell of forest floor and stagnant water, a scent that had no business existing inside a windowless, concrete-reinforced psychiatric ward, anchored the experience to a reality I could not explain away. I turned, intending to march toward the nursing station, to find Eleanor Shaw and demand to know who had played this elaborate, sadistic prank. But the corridor had elongated. The fluorescent lights overhead, previously a steady hum of artificial daylight, now flickered with a rhythmic, sickly pulse, casting long, bruised shadows that seemed to drag behind me like tethered ghosts. "Nurse Shaw," I called out. My voice sounded thin, stripped of its usual clinical authority. It echoed off the linoleum, traveling far too long before it died away. "Eleanor, this is Dr. Vance. I require assistance in the South Wing corridor." Silence. Not the silence of an empty room, but the oppressive, expectant silence of a stage waiting for an actor to miss their cue. I began to walk. The linoleum felt soft under my loafers, almost sponge-like, as if the floorboards were shifting beneath the surface. I checked my wristwatch. 10:14 a.m. I had entered room 9 at 10:05, 9 minutes. I quickened my pace, my heart drumming a frantic tattoo against my ribs. I reached a junction, or what should have been a junction, and skidded to a halt. The hallway did not lead to the nurse's station. It curved sharply to the left, descending into a staircase that I knew from my orientation yesterday did not exist. The walls here were different. The peeling beige paint of the upper floors gave way to exposed, sweating stone, weeping a dark, viscous substance that pooled in the corners. "Don't panic. You are experiencing a fugue state. You've had a breakdown. You walked into a utility stairwell, and your mind is dressing it in symbols of your anxiety." I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the weeping eye key. It felt warm now, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that set my teeth on edge. I pulled it out. The metal was tarnished, the surface etched with fine microscopic veins that looked disturbingly like a circulatory system. The eye at the bow of the key seemed to track my movement, its gaze fixed on me with an intelligence that defied the dead weight of brass. "This isn't real," I whispered, the sound vibrating in my throat. "Real is a variable, doctor, not a constant." I spun around. The voice had come from everywhere and nowhere, a dry, papery sound like autumn leaves skittering over pavement. "Who's there?" I demanded, raising the key as if it were a weapon. There was no one, only the flickering, dying lights and the oppressive, tightening walls. My scientific arrogance, once my greatest shield, was now a jagged, useless shard. I tried to reach for the familiar concepts of psychopathology: dissociative fugue, transient psychosis, hallucinatory projection, but they felt like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a screen door. I took a step toward the stairs, but the floor groaned. A ripple moved through the linoleum, a literal wave of solid ground. I lost my footing, crashing to my knees. The impact jarred my teeth, and for a split second, the floor became transparent. I stared down into the foundation of the building. I didn't see pipes, wires, or concrete. I saw layers, thousands of them, compressed, calcified layers of human history, faded hospital gowns, broken spectacles, discarded intake forms, and shadows that moved in a slow, rhythmic respiration. The building was breathing. It was a vast, subterranean organ, and I was a foreign object, an irritant, currently being digested. I scrambled backward, gasping, my palms raw from the grit on the floor. I needed Shaw. She had been here the longest. She had the pragmatic, calloused wisdom that survived the ward's daily cruelty. If anyone knew how to navigate this impossible geography, it was her. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling violently. I turned back the way I had come, but the corridor behind me had folded itself into a blind alley. I was trapped. I clutched the key so tightly the metal bit into my palm, drawing blood. The moment the copper scent of it hit the air, the walls seemed to sigh. The flickering lights stabilized, casting a harsh, clinical glare over the corridor. I realized then that I wasn't being chased. I was being herded. The asylum wasn't just a building. It was an architecture of intent, and it was waiting for me to use the key. I looked at the weeping eye, its metal pupil dilated. My pulse hammered in my ears, a frantic rhythmic reminder of my own finite, fragile biology. I looked at the end of the hall, where a single heavy oak door had manifested. It stood silent, imposing, and entirely alien to the sterile, late-century decor of the ward. I am a man of science, I told myself, though the words tasted like ash. I am here to diagnose. But as I took the first step toward the door, my reflection caught in the polished brass plate caught my attention. I didn't see a doctor. I saw a man with hollowed-out eyes and a mouth stitched shut by the very silence he had spent his career trying to document. I pressed the key into the lock. It turned with a sound like grinding teeth. The door creaked open, revealing not a room, but a vast shadowed expanse where the ceiling seemed to stretch into an infinite starless night. From the darkness came a sound, not a whisper, but a chorus. Thousands of voices, overlapping, discordant, all speaking my name at once. Elias. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I stepped into the dark and the door clicked shut behind me, severing the last thread of the world I had known. Your story ends here. The nightmare doesn't. If you want more terrifying tales, like, comment, and subscribe to Dr. Never Sleeps. The lights will go out, the silence will return, and when it does, listen carefully. Another story is about to begin.